Welcome to the Virtual Shift, a show looking at the seismic changes happening in healthcare with virtual care at the epicenter. Join me and my guests as we look at key cultural and policy shifts impacting how providers, payers, and patients connect, as well as how care is being reimagined both for today and the future. Hello, and thanks for tuning in today. I'm your host, Tom Foley. You can learn more about this show by visiting the program on healthcarenowradio.com, and be sure to follow me on LinkedIn, Twitter at FoleyTom, and the hashtag The Virtual Shift. Today we have a great guest on, very interesting conversation that we're going to have with Aisha Pittman. She is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at the National Association of ACOs. Aisha, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks, Tom. Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So you have been very busy lately. There's been a couple of things going on in the regulatory space. We had the completion of the 2023 Medicare physician fee schedule, and there's a number of different things in there from an ACO perspective that I hope you'll be able to give us some background on. As well, the omnibus bill that was just passed in the previous Congress had a number of different elements that are beneficial to the ACOs. So those will be the core points of conversation. But before we get there, tell us a little bit about yourself and the National Association of ACOs.
Yeah, great. So the National Association of ACOs represents organizations that function as accountable care organizations. We have, I think, over 400 ACOs that participate in MSSP, a large sum that participate in the ACO REACH program. But then in addition to that, our members are doing ACO arrangements with other payers in Medicaid, in Medicare Advantage, with commercial payers as well. So it's not just focused on the traditional Medicare ACO programs, but is much broader than that. And then for myself, I've been working in value-based care for quite some time. I'm new to the National Association of ACOs. I've been here about 6 months, but prior to that, I worked for Premier, where I was in their government relations team and focused on all things payment policy, which included population health payment. And in that role, I got to partner with groups like the National Association of ACOs and others that are really focused on transitioning from fee-for-service to value-based care.
It's interesting. Just a real quick aside, ACOs have a great position, right? I want to increase it's all about value. But at that same time, decreasing the cost of care while increasing the quality of care, which is kind of an oxymoron in and of itself. But ACOs have been, it seems, have been struggling in getting a stronghold in momentum moving forward. What are your thoughts on that? As you know, it's the whole idea for moving off of fee for service to a value-based care model. Any particular call outs on challenges as to why that is?
Yeah, I think, we are 10 years, almost 11, 12 now into the ACO movement, and we've learned a lot. Ultimately, moving to an ACO is a voluntary approach. It takes a lot of upfront investment and really rethinking how you deliver care. And not everyone is in a place to make those upfront investments. So that's some of the challenge. I think also, we've learned a lot recently about the overall ACO structure in that it is very driven off of primary care. So how beneficiaries align to the ACOs based on primary care services. And what that has led to is we see a little bit less participation by specialists within the ACO for a variety of reasons. I think that's one challenge that the Innovation Center is taking on now, which will really help grow and expand the population as well. So it's, the upfront investment, just change takes time. But then also we are now discovering some things about programmatic structure, whether that's the type of providers that can come into it or how the benchmarks are set and how that leads to success or challenges. We're 10 years in, and I think we have a good sense of some of the challenges and are really thinking through how to resolve them to make to ensure the long-term success of the program and really grow the program.
Interesting. So let's shift to the actual agenda that we established. I apologize for that diversion, but it was an interesting point, and I appreciate your response and insights. So let's start first with the fee schedule. Back in, I believe it was November, the Medicare released the 2023 Medicare physician fee schedule and had some key provisions in there from an ACO perspective. Can you give us some highlights as to what was in that fee schedule?
Yep. And I think some of what's in the fee schedule points just to the challenges I was talking about. So one of the things that we saw come into place is the Advanced Investment Payment Program. This program provides new ACOs and ACOs that have providers that typically have not participated. So like getting towards some more of your rural providers, smaller physician groups, gives them funding upfront to invest in the ACO and do all of the needed technology investments, the staffing investments that it takes to get an ACO up and running. And it's ultimately they pay that back by reducing their shared savings as they achieve savings later in the program. But it's as I was talking about, one of the challenges, not all providers have the ability to make those upfront investments. And this is in recognition of it. And it builds off of a program we saw before that was implemented by CMS. And this just gives it as a more permanent option in the program for new folks coming in. And so that's a huge thing that'll just really help with bringing providers that haven't typically participated and recognizing the upfront costs.
Well, let's get the audience a bit because Medicare has made this I won't say an edict, but they've kind of set this goal that by 2030 everybody should be involved in a value-based program. So this is something that everybody needs to start to pay attention to, right? So when you say investment, tell us more about what that investment entails.
Yep. So if you are starting a new ACO, we know that first, there's technology to both that helps with population health. So things like your data systems. So being able to look at your data comprehensively across the continuum of care. Think about staffing a little bit differently. ACOs often employ a lot of care managers. Also, from sort of a staffing perspective, you're incented to work with providers across the continuum and to think about how lowering care. So you need many more folks around who are out working with the other providers that are in your region or market to think about that comprehensive continuum of care. This is the virtual shift. ACOs deploy a lot of virtual care, and so it's technology to administer virtual care. It's the staff to do it as well. And so anything around changing and innovating care has often both a staff and technology component associated with it. And it's those initial costs.
Yeah, interesting insight. So we'll get into the virtual side in a minute, but the idea that most of the virtual care elements, let's talk about telehealth, remote patient monitoring, therapeutic monitoring, chronic care management, are more fee-for-service like elements. But I believe that the adoption of such programs does also facilitate a patient moving from awareness to wellness, as I say, and can do that at a lower cost. So it does achieve the increase the value of care, increases the whole patient engagement side of the equation, and reduces cost in the long run. But that's to your point, that's an investment in and of itself, because you got to be patient on relative to implementing the program and then start to receive the results over time. Some of it is more immediate, some of it is more longer term. The point there being is, from an ACO perspective and the way ACOs are paid out versus a fee for service, can you correlate the two in how an ACO adopt remote patient monitoring as an example, but not yet in a fee for service like manner, how they get compensated?
So I think that one of the longer term challenges that we are trying to solve with the ACO program is that it's still ultimately fee for service payment. And if we look at a model like ACO Reach, it's starting to shift some of it away from fee for service payment to the ability to look at other payment models, because that model requires at least primary care capitation, and then you can expand your capitated amount beyond that. So ACOs are telehealth, remote patient monitoring, chronic care management, it is deployed in a way that is similar to fee for service. The benefit of an ACO is that you have waivers that get you out of those constraints of fee for service. So what we saw with the telehealth flexibilities that were provided as part of the PHE, those waivers have been in place, not exactly the same, but similar waivers have been in place for ACOs since early in the program. And I think what we really learned is that the waivers that ACOs had weren't flexible enough. And so as once we look to the expiration of these flexibilities, and I know the omnibus extended how long they go after the PHE, but we'll want to think about not only for fee for service, what flexibilities are there, but how can ACOs have even more flexibility since they're ultimately responsible for total cost of care? So it's still fee for service aligned now. They've always had some ability to do things a little bit differently, but we really want to see the reins taken off of ACOs since they are responsible for the care continuum. And there is an incentive not to lead to overuse of services, which I think is sometimes, which is often the concern about opening up some virtual care elements so much more within fee for service.
Interesting. As you know, I'm a huge advocate when you talk about ACOs and needing to develop transformational programs to ultimately be responsible for those quality of care and the overall delivery of care. It's I find it, the health system in and of itself is separate from the patient's perspective, right? And the point there is that how many patients really know what an ACO is and whether or not their doctor is actually involved in an ACO, and how many know that provider's payments are at risk. If I was a person with diabetes, I could be fired, if you will, the old adage of from as being a patient because I'm not really compliant with the care plan of my provider's prescribing. So there just seems to be an alignment issue relative to what fee schedules are and what the omnibus might have versus what the patient knows about what they're involved in, right? Other than, hey, I got to get better. I got a chronic condition and I got to do something.
Yeah.
Hopefully they'll do something.
You're touching on one of the issues that I think is a top priority topic for us this year and in the years to come. So we know there's a lot of good data and studies out there that ACOs are beneficial, that they're saving costs compared to fee for service, that it's getting patients higher quality care, that patient satisfaction is good. But ultimately, you're correct. Often patients don't know that they're in an ACO. And I think that is sometimes a challenge to continuing the movement because there is this lack of patient awareness. And so we're really thinking about how do we better engage patients or think about patient engagement differently. I think there's a lot of patient engagement when it comes to the population health management core functions, but that piece of understanding that their providers are on the hook for how they are cared for. I think that element is missing, and it's something that we're looking at. I think that it also gets to a how patients come into an ACO. It's very passive. It's based on historical claims traditionally. And now we're seeing this option of more voluntary enrollment, both in ACO REACH and in MSSP. And there's sort of two different approaches for it there. But I think that is giving ACOs tools to think about how they engage patients and giving patients the ability to say they want to opt into this type of care. Similar to, I mean, it's a very different enrollment. The voluntary alignment is very different than like a Medicare Advantage enrollment, but it's sort of trying to create some parallels there in that the patient could see the value in this and would want to opt in, or knows that their provider is in an ACO and they see the additional benefits that they get from it and want to opt in. So we're just starting to test that. And I think we're just starting to understand that. And that's something we would want to see expand in the program to really help grow the program.
Yeah, we often talk about three words: access, engagement, and outcomes. If you provide the access and you educate the patient as to what they're being asked to participate in, they'll engage. And if you engage them, they will respond in multiples. And then that ultimately leads for outcomes. And when I talk about outcomes, it's the financial outcomes that the provider is looking for, right? They're not a charity for sure. But at the same time, it's the clinical outcomes, right? So if you can get people on that page, that's awesome. I mean, we do, as you know, remote patient monitoring, chronic care management, and we tend to we never talk to the patient, frankly, about what the criteria for reimbursements are. The 16-day measure is not a known element, because we ultimately talk to them about taking their vitals twice a day, right? So if you miss a day, in our view, our program, you'd miss two vitals, as opposed to in a fee for service arrangement, you're still safe, right? So the understanding the program that they're in and what their commitment is, we just see if we just change the tune a little bit, patients will engage, and I don't care what anybody says. Older people do use smartphones and they do use technology. They're not as fluid as maybe my 4-year-old niece who uses technology all the time, but nonetheless, they do use technology, and they do engage if you ask them to and you tell them why, right?
I think it's that story of understanding the why. So ACOs can offer much more benefits and access to things that you don't have in fee for service. Even things like we're testing this concept of being able to reduce cost sharing for certain services. That type of thing is a patient benefit that is very unknown. So I think part of in thinking about patient engagement and helping patients understand ACOs is understanding what benefits that they get from it, not necessarily the underlying payment model, but what they would opt into this because it gives them these extra things, or they know that they are going to get a designated care manager and a line that they can call 24/7 and be able to reach someone and talk to someone if that's necessary. That's really about how we're thinking about the patient piece in order to really help patients understand what's the benefit here. Why is this different from something traditional, and why would I want to be a part of it?
Exactly. It has nothing to do with, while I can appreciate you need technology, but if you start the discussion about technology, it ultimately becomes complex and people disengage. But if you talk about value and benefits, people understand that if they pay less, that's a benefit to them. So I hate to say it's all about the money, I'm not meaning to indicate that that's the only reason why patients engage, but benefits over feature function wins every day, in my view. Mm-hmm. So anything more in the physician fee schedule that we should discuss before we shift over to the omnibus bill?
I mean, I think there were just I think that AIP is one of the prominent things to bring in new folks to the program. There's just a recognition of other changes that need to be made. So things like giving ACOs more time in upside only, that's beneficial because, we know it takes a long time from start to get to the point where you're ready to manage risk. So that creates some more stability in the program, making the highest risk track more optional. There was discussion about recognition that the benchmarks can become unfavorable if you remain in the program for a long time. And how do you solve that piece where at some point you can only cut a certain amount off of what your historical spending was until you get to a point where it's this is just what you need to, the amount of money you need to deliver care effectively. So recognition of that and it was just an RFI, but it starts the discussion of how do we move forward. So I think all of those things really point to expansion of the program and ensuring the long-term success. So we were really encouraged by many of those provisions.
Interesting. Very good. Good stuff. So let's shift the discussion to the omnibus bill. To be honest with you, I haven't read much about the omnibus bill and what was in it from a ACO perspective. So if you can educate the audience, that would be great.
Yeah. So I all of the payment provisions, so things like the PAYGO and the increased physician payment for 2 years, ultimately impact providers in ACOs because still built on a fee-for-service system. But I think the biggest thing for ACOs was an extension of incentive payments for those who are taking on this. So this was put in place back in part of MACRA back in 2015, and it gives a bonus payment on all Part B payments for any APMs, not just ACOs, any downside risk Medicare APM, if you meet a certain amount of having patients or payment volume through the APM. And so that was set in MACRA as a way to incent providers to not only adopt APMs, but then to go a step farther and take on downside risk. And so they were set to expire at the end of this year, although there's a 2-year delay in payment. So end of 2022 was the last year to qualify for payment that would have been received in 2024. And so we have another year. So 2023 is now the last year to qualify, which would pay a bonus in 2025. So we're encouraged by that. While the amount of the incentive payment was lowered, it was historically 5%. It went down to 3.5% for this 1-year extension. And we only had a 1-year extension. But it just sends a good signal that Congress sees the importance of continuing value-based care. And I think it sets us up for a nice discussion in the next Congress of how do we want to move forward with continuing this path to value overall.
Yeah. And that's the key, is that, what's going to be the benchmark over the next year relative to whether or not more providers come into the program versus it just not being enough incentive and having the 2030 goal at risk, right? Is it going to be more? So I was just curious as to whether or not you see any particular benchmarks that might be telling to the market that, more needs to be done in an ACO world relative to getting physicians off of a fee for schedule and more into a risk-oriented program.
I mean, I think ultimately, if we think about the physician payment challenges, and while there was it was not what the physician community was asking for, we're sort of back in this place of having to go to Congress constantly to think about what is the best physician payment approach. And I think the more you can get folks away from fee-for-service and into value models, we have to stop having that continual conversation. So I know we're sort of thinking about it in one way of there's still a lot to be solved with physician payment going forward. As you think about that, how do you continue to pair incentives to move to value to have that overall shift occur?
Yeah.
So that's one way in which we're hoping.
I often advocate that, to get the experience in a different delivery of care model, the virtual care scenarios play out, right? Telehealth, virtual, meeting the patient in their home, remote patient monitoring, chronic care management. You can do all that without taking on any quote unquote risk, but you get the experience as to those different programs, those different revenue models, and you can ultimately realize, hey, I can actually do this. And now, as opposed to jumping in, I know there's a period of time where you have to adjust to taking on that risk once you join the program. But I think that's another approach in that, geez, it just makes logical sense that a remote patient monitoring program for those that have one or more chronic conditions makes sense, right? As opposed to my audience often hears the average Medicare patient, 5 chronic conditions, sees 9 different doctors, only spends 15 hours in front of their doctor in a given year. The biggest question relative to how do we get the value is what do I do? What does the patient do in the other 8,745 hours in a given year, right?
Yeah.
That's really where care needs to be. And if you can close that gap through engagement, through these virtual care programs, that ultimately delivers the value. And so the point there being is, I think that these virtual programs are stepping stones into an ACO, and just makes them that much more prepared for class, if you will, relative to how we get there.
Yeah,
Your
and
thoughts?
I agree, and I think that it's a stepping stone, but it's also, at the end of the day, we recognize there's costs associated with these things. And
Yeah.
our fee for service system is not set up in a way that is ever going to really adequately account for virtual care. You really have to think about where you're shifting costs. And that's what an ACO does. They look at what comprehensively happens for a patient across the continuum and thinks about where they can invest. And I know one of the places that they're investing a lot is in virtual care, because they are able to reduce services elsewhere. And so just in a fee for service, you're never really going to get to that comprehensive thought. And I think this is why the upside only is an opportunity, when you can have those abilities to shift the costs and think about those necessary investments without being penalized. It then gives you the experience to have even more flexibility and be at risk.
Aisha, we're going to need to leave it there. I really appreciate your insights. This is a great conversation, very informative. So Aisha Pittman, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at the National Association of ACOs. Aisha, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. We'll certainly have you on again soon, if you're willing.
Always willing.
Awesome. All right. Have a great day. I want to thank the show sponsors, HP. HP Engage Long Lifecycle Products provides the stability, safety, and security you need, plus flexibility and performance designed for today and tomorrow. As well, GenieMD, providing a modular, scalable, and customizable virtual care platform and clinical services to help providers extend care into the home, increasing access and quality while driving new revenue opportunities. If you missed part of today's episode, you can tune in at the same time, 11 a.m. or 7 p.m. Eastern, throughout the week, and be sure to check out the program page on healthcarenowradio.com. And remember, connect or follow me on LinkedIn, Twitter at FoleyTom, and follow the show's hashtag, The Virtual Shift. I'm Tom Foley. Until the next shift.